In the last episode of this series, we started to look at the gesture of sitting down into a chair. I explained that Jando Masoero would have us delay bending at the ankle joints when we go to sit. He says there are two phases to sitting. First, we should bend only the knee and hip joints, and then, once our pelvis is over the chair, we go into the second phase, where we do bend the ankle. The question we were left with was, why do we want to delay bending at the ankle? Can such a small difference in how we bend our legs when sitting actually result in a meaningful change? Let's first look at what happens when you bend your ankles from the beginning, as that will help us see the differences. If you initiate sitting down by bending the ankle, knee, and hip joints, which is certainly the common way to sit, what will happen is that you will immediately start loading the lower leg. We can imagine an elastic that goes down the back of the lower leg and connects to the bottom of the foot. As we bend our knee forward, we are stretching the elastic. We are essentially loading the spring of our lower leg. In real life, this spring is made of extensor muscles, which have elastic properties, the Achilles tendon, and the other tendons and fascia both at the bottom of the foot and in the legs. But you can only load this spring so much, and most people in the modern world have a diminished range of motion when it comes to bending at the ankle. So your average person is not even going to go as far as is possible before they have to stop bending the knee forward. If you started the sitting gesture by moving the knee forward, you will still be a good foot or so above the chair when you can no longer bend your ankles. What are you going to do? How are you going to get down to the chair? Observation reveals that what happens to most people is that they will release the spring they've loaded in their lower leg, and that will propel them backwards. The person will fall backwards. Some will lower their torso massively, while others will arch their back and press their lower ribs forward. These movements provide some counterbalance to all the weight that is falling back, but at the expense of shortening your torso. Either way, the person will land near the back of the chair. So now let's explore the new way of sitting down. If we refuse to bend at the ankle joints to start off, our lower leg will be essentially unchanged as we move the pelvis back over the chair and lean the torso. Then, in the second phase of sitting, we will begin to load the lower leg by bending at the ankle joints and allowing the knee to move forward in space. It takes some time to coordinate the movements of this properly, and we'll look at how to do that as this series continues. But in this second phase of sitting, we can lower the pelvis straight down to the chair. We won't need to lower our torso dramatically because we're not losing our balance backward. Instead, we can keep the torso angled 20 to 30 degrees. When we land on the chair, we will be on the edge of the chair with our sit bones. Our thighs will not be on the chair, and our knees will be forward, meaning the lower leg will still be loaded. From here, we can sit up to upright. Simply put, if you bend your ankles from the beginning when you go to sit, you are loading your lower leg too soon. You end up having to release the spring in order to actually get down to the chair, and so you're propelled backwards, and you fall into the chair. If you want to maintain control over your movements as you sit, you can delay bending at the ankle joints. Then you will only be loading the lower leg as you lower yourself to the chair. And here's where we get to the major benefit of having delayed loading the lower leg. Because when we want to stand up, we have a loaded spring ready to help us. If we simply lean forward with the torso, we will find ourselves back to where we were when we landed on the chair. Then, by releasing the spring, we can propel the knee backwards. That is, we can straighten the lower leg and stand. We'll obviously look more deeply into that in the future. But what happens when you want to stand up if you're far back in the chair with your legs straight? If you lean your torso forward from where you are, you will have very little leverage. You don't have the spring in your leg loaded, so you must either heave yourself forward and up, lean your torso quite severely down, or push yourself up by some other means. Many will move forward to the edge of the chair first, and even pull back their feet. We may not understand why this gives us leverage, but we know it does. Here we can see the point of examining and understanding how we perform a gesture. We can, by familiarizing ourselves with the mechanisms of the body, determine what is a more or less reasonable way to perform a gesture. We can see that one way of sitting will lead to us being collapsed and slumped in our chair, while a different way of sitting could allow us to remain poised and even stand back up with much more efficiency. If you look at explanations of how to sit that are out there, they will almost always demonstrate that you should massively lower your torso, angling it quite severely in order to sit. That will prevent you from plopping down hard on the chair, but it doesn't actually prevent you from falling back or falling onto the chair. What's happening is the person is reaching their sit bones very far back, and to balance that out, they lean very far forward. But is this the best way to sit? Do you need to lean that far forward? Well, if you don't move your sit bones, which are at the bottom of your pelvis, so far back, you wouldn't need to. And yet, the first problem that we will have in going into the first stage of sitting is that people will not move their pelvis back far enough. Many people struggle at first to make this gesture of bending just the hip and knee joints. They only want to move their hips back a little bit. If you ask them to go further back, they will often end up pointing the sit bones back quite severely to do so. Is it possible to move the hips back in space without pointing the sit bones severely back? The sit bones will move back in space along with the rest of the pelvis, but do they have to dramatically go back? We of course know that if the sit bones go essentially back and up, that the iliacs on the other end of the pelvis will go forward and down. Experiment a little with this first phase of sitting, then join me next episode, and we'll dig into bending the knee in the new way and see how we can take that into the second phase of sitting.